Hello and welcome to this GCSE video about biodiversity. So in this video we're talking about biodiversity, what it is, how things interdepend on each other and what an ecosystem is. So what do we actually mean by biodiversity? Well, all biodiversity is basically a measure of the variety and number of species residing within an ecosystem. A healthy ecosystem has a large biodiversity, a large degree of interdependence between species, and provides stability for all inhabitants. So this is where we come to these two ideas of species richness and species evenness. So species richness is basically how many different species do you have in an ecosystem. Species evenness is how many of those species do you have in an ecosystem. So if you have an ecosystem which has got, say, 4 different species, but of the 100 animals there, 98 are one species, and the others are from the other 3 species. That is not very biodiverse. Whereas if you have an area of 100 species, and each one has 4 members each, that's both species rich and even. So that's what we're looking for. At GCSE level, you don't need to know any more than that about species richness and evenness, so we'll look at interdependence between species now. So when we think about biodiversity, we really need to start thinking about ecosystems and where organisms live. So ecosystems are really dependent on 2 types of factors: abiotic, which are non-living, and biotic, which are living factors. Okay, we'll cover biotic in a little bit, but first let's think about abiotic. These are your obvious physical environment sort of things, so stuff such as shelter, water, light, temperature, nutrients in the soil, that kind of thing. So it basically, think about what would allow things to grow, and think about places where you've got a lot of species. They're there because they have these kind of abiotic factors in abundance of shelter, water, light, temperature. So this bit then brings us to biotic factors. Biotic factors are living factors within an ecosystem. So it's basically interdependence between different organisms. So for example, the big one, which you should know, is predation. So that is where one animal will hunt and eat another animal, or herbivory. So that's an animal eating a plant. That obviously is a massive factor in an ecosystem, because the more animals you have trying to eat you, the less likely you are to stay somewhere and to be particularly species even. However, don't forget there's also mutualism, where you've got 2 species living by each other which are benefiting each other. You have parasitism, where one species lives on another species doing harm to the other species, and commensalism. So that's where one species benefits, but the other species isn't affected either way by the presence of that species. So thinking about biotic factors and thinking about feeding relationships in particular, you'll be familiar with the food chains from Key Stage 3. So the idea behind the food chain is basically you have a producer, which is a grass in this case, which is getting energy directly from the sun through photosynthesis. You then have a feeding relationship where the grasshopper will eat the grass, the frog eats the grasshopper, the python eats the frog, and the eagle eats the python. Nothing eats the eagle, so we call that an apex predator. So the couple of things to note with this, as you're probably aware, these arrows don't show what actually eats what, it shows energy flow. And rather than calling them just chains in the food chain, we call them trophy levels. So trophy level 1 is your producer, trophy level 2 is your primary consumer, 3 is your secondary consumer, and so on and so forth. So food chains have their place. They show simple relationships between things that eat each other. However, very rarely do living organisms, only eat one thing. So rather than using a food chain, we use a food web. This shows us a bit more of what's going on. So for example, the fruit fly, it won't just be eaten by a thrush, it'll be eaten by a dragonfly, and it could also be eaten by a frog. The butterfly can be eaten by a dragonfly and a frog as well. So you've got multiple food chains going on. This is what I mean by interdependence. Everything depends on each other in an ecosystem. This is why it's so difficult if you were to, say, remove one organism from this. So if we were to say remove the fruit fly from this ecosystem because, for example, we're a farmer and that's getting in the way of our mangoes that we're trying to grow, what could then end up happening is our thrush number could decrease, our eagle number could decrease, our dragonfly number could decrease because they're all interlinked, they all depend on each other. So while food chains and food webs have their uses, we prefer to show things in feeding relationships in terms of pyramids. So this here is an example of a pyramid of numbers. So in the first example here, it works out quite nicely because say we have 1,000 clovers being eaten by 700 snails, being eaten by 200 thrushes, being eaten by 10 sparrowhawks. That then works out as a pyramid. Excellent, that's what we want, okay? In this example though, we've got one oak tree being eaten by thousands of insects, being eaten by hundreds of woodpeckers. This now is not a pyramid. It's a weird shape, right? And here we've got, that's example number 2. Example number 3, we have a lot of grass being eaten by a few rabbits, which have been eaten by lots of fleas. So again, this doesn't quite work. It's a weird shape. It's not a pyramid. The reason we want a pyramid is we want to show the energy flow from one level to another. What this is basically showing us, in this one, it's fine, but in examples number 2 and 3, it's showing that either energy is being made, in this case, or destroyed and then remade in this case, which doesn't work. So we need to think of a different way of representing these feeding relationships rather than just using pure numbers. So rather than using pyramids of numbers, we use something called pyramids of biomass instead, because pyramids of numbers don't often work. So we use pyramids of biomass, and all biomass is a dried mass of the organisms. So let's say we had one tree and the tree was 1,000 kilograms in weight, in mass. That would equal 1,000 kilograms of biomass, okay, the dried weight of the tree. And the reason we do this is it works out much better because obviously we've got this much biomass of tree. And so therefore some of this biomass is going up the food chain to the caterpillar, some of it is going to the bootit, and some of it is going to the sparrowhawk. Not much, so therefore sparrowhawk is at apex predator here, nothing's going to eat it. It works better in numbers because as you see on the pyramid on the left and the pyramid numbers, because we've only got one tree, it looks like we're creating energy. Here, we can now start to explain what's actually going on in these feeding relationships. So as we go along each trophic level, you'll notice that each time biomass being lost, okay? So if we start off with 1,000 kilograms of producer, we end up with 100 kilograms of primary consumer, 10 kilograms of second consumer, 1 kilogram of tertiary consumer. So each trophic level, we are losing biomass. So that leads to a natural question, where is this biomass going? So if you think about it, when we eat, or when an organism eats, what happens is biomass is taken in as food, gets digested. Some of it isn't digested, so some of it's lost straight away through the feces, so that's called egestion. Don't confuse egestion with excretion. Excretion is things which have been in your body, so that's things such as breathing out carbon dioxide or urinating. Egestion is things which have never technically been inside our body, so it goes through the alimentary canal, it's our undigested bones and things that we don't pick up like fibre. So that's our egestion, okay? So some of the biomass goes there. Other biomass is used for respiration, for growth, for nutrition, that kind of thing, the living processes of this organism. So only some of it is turned into new horse biomass. And it's about 10%. So each point you lose 10%, you can pass on 10% of the biomass that you've taken in, which is why all feeding relationships generally have a maximum of 4 or 5 levels. You don't get much more than either a tertiary or quaternary consumer, because after that, there's too much needed to be eaten, too much biomass is being lost. I hope this video helped you understand a little bit about biomass and biodiversity and the importance of our ecosystems. Any questions, please drop us a comment below. Thank you.